This podcast is brought to you by Kyoto Japan Automotive Group, a company which I've known personally for over 20 years, and your one-stop shop for tires, batteries, and auto parts. Visit their website at www.kyotojap.com for more details. Hello everyone. It's exactly 2 weeks since we learned of the victory of Donald Trump over Kamala Harris. And though it was a decisive margin, there are still an awful lot of Americans who are suffering various degrees of shock, horror or despair, and an even larger number in various stages of elation. Today our topic is not America, not exclusively. I covered that quite extensively with my past 3 guests, but today I will cover the fascinating triangle of America, Russia and Europe. 1.2 billion people, more or less. 15% of the world's population, more or less. 3 places with vastly different histories, a variety of different languages, and distinctively different cultures, and hugely different contributions to world culture, well, at least to Western culture. However, they all have the power to inflict tremendous damage on the other. And within the last 100 years or a little over, they've demonstrated that with about 40 million deaths in World War I and 50 million deaths, casualties in World War II. These are the estimates that I've read. And all 3 places, America, Russia and Europe, possess the nuclear capability to destroy life as we know it. Now, we've enjoyed a peace in Europe of sorts since 1945, but for many years we've had war in Europe. Most of us, frankly, have looked the other way because it was in former Yugoslavia or in Armenia or Georgia or an invasion of Crimea. But since 2022, Europeans have had to face up to a protracted war in the Ukraine, with Goliath, Russia, pitched against David, Ukraine. It was to have been a short war. It hasn't been. But America is soon to be present again, says he will end it soon. We shall see. But perhaps we need to try harder to understand each other rather than blast each other to pieces. Today my guest is from Belgium, one of Europe's smaller countries. He's interesting to listen to on this topic of Europe, America, Russia, and understanding each other better because he's just retired from being his country's ambassador in Washington, D.C. And immediately before that, he was Belgium's ambassador in Moscow. Who could better explain all sides to us? Ambassador Jean-Arthur Regibeau, welcome to the McKay interview. It's good to have you here, and thanks for making time for us.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here.
It's good to see you. We are in the comfortable and welcoming Warwick, Geneva, and have just finished a very successful business lunch with members, guests of the British Swiss Chamber of Commerce, the American International Club of Geneva, and the Business Club of Belgium and Luxembourg in Switzerland and Liechtenstein. We had a full house. The audience enjoyed your speech, Ambassador. Let's address some of the matters you talked about regarding America, Russia, and Europe, and better understanding. It's too big a topic to cover in the time we have, but at least let us try. My first question is, we've all had time to absorb the result of the elections in the United States on the 5th of November. Was the result a surprise to you?
No and yes. No, because according to all polls and predictions, that was going to be a very close race, so kind of 50-50. But the result was a bit surprising in the sense that it was not close at all. According to the latest result I saw, that Donald Trump increased his share of the votes by 3% in almost all counties of the country, even in significantly democratic states like New York and New Jersey. So the size of the win was a bit of a surprise.
And why do you think the Democrats lost? Why do you think the Democrats lost so comprehensively?
Well, there are many reasons. You know, some people mention the fact that the incumbent lost, that it was a woman of color, that Biden left too late the race. There were no primaries to make the case for Kamala Harris. There was a lack of legitimacy for the same reason. But most people agree that it was due to two main factors, inflation and migration. And indeed, you can argue that some mistakes were made in that respect, actually distributing too much money after COVID and leaving the door open to many migrants just after Biden took office. But I think that this is just superficial arguments, and we should go a bit deeper in order to understand the state of the American society and the possible consequences for us European. First is that heavily on the Democratic side, i.e. the Democratic Party, the voters came from college-educated people in society, whereas it was exactly the opposite among Trump voters. And so it seems to me that to some extent the Democratic Party lost touch with the common people. Someone commented a few days ago, the Democrats went from the family kitchen to the faculty lounge, and they lost something in the process. And what I found very interesting in following many of my American friends, most of them Democrats, saying that people needed to be educated about, for example, the social media. Well, I think that it's one more evidence that they're losing touch, because you don't want to educate voters. You probably need to explain to voters what the challenges are and what the possible consequences, but you need to convince them, first of all. I remember a statement by a Belgian minister who said more than 30 years ago, well, in a democracy, what matters is not to be right, but to convince other people that you are right.
Yes, very well put, very well put. But let me ask you a slightly nuanced question then, Jean-Arthur. What do you think that ordinary Americans, and that would be the mass of Americans, so not the college-educated Americans, what do you think they want from their politicians?
I think, first of all, they want to be listened to.
Listened to.
And I think that explains also the extent of Trump's support in the country. Too many voters have the feelings that they don't matter in the eyes of the people they elected before. So that's point number one. Point number two, and that's typically American, they expect opportunities. So they don't expect necessarily a lot from the government. That's different from the European political culture, but they want to be in front of opportunities so that they can enjoy a better life, improve their life.
But you're saying that the Democrats are taking opportunities away from them?
No, I would not go that far, but there is a very interesting evolution in American society that was mentioned to me by a former director of the German Marshall Fund. 30 years ago, you had 10% of the population in the US owning 30% of the wealth in the country. Well, nowadays, these numbers are 10% of the population is owning 60% of the wealth in the country. That's a huge difference.
Yes, I see. What puzzles me is that there's a similarity between what you've observed in America with what's happening in the United Kingdom, with this elite group that many academics have identified, and where the Labour Party, traditionally the party of Labour, seems to have lost contact with working people to the extent that they say working people ad nauseum. Maybe they don't mean it, but I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your recollections, your memories of the way that the US government works. I mean, did you find good things, bad things, mysterious things about the way government works at the different levels?
Well, my experience in the US is very similar to what we experience in Europe. So no major surprise. They respond to voters, to the media, to a statement in Parliament. So nothing mysterious about it. And I would say that that's how it should happen in a democracy, that there are real debates and exchange of arguments. What is a bit puzzling coming from Europe, because it's much stronger in the US than in our own countries, is the communication style developed by Donald Trump and seemingly very popular, because it seems to legitimate all sorts of lies, and that is a bit disturbing.
As you use the word uncompromising lies as opposed to different versions of the truth.
Yes, because, for example, when he mentioned the migrants eating dogs and cats in Springfield, Ohio, well, nobody could bring any evidence about that.
And do you think people believe that?
No, but that was not the point. The point was that he was making his case about migration using a communication technique that would make everybody listen to it. And so what the people kept in their mind was, well, he's underlining a real problem about migration, not the fact that they were actually eating cats or dogs.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And would you compare the way the US government works when compared with Belgium's constitutional monarchy, for example? Wasn't it Belgium that once went for months without a government and still functioned? I mean, what should we, that's non-Belgians like me, learn from government that just sometimes disappears for a while? Or is that a bad example, using Belgium?
Well, I think, first, Belgium is a very specific case. We have probably the most complex constitution in the world.
Is that so?
And we have been indeed with a caretaker government for 18 months. But we're also a federal country, which means that at the same time we had regional governments. Yes. Of course, we had also municipalities. And very important, we had a functioning parliament. And even without a proper government, parliament was able to vote a budget, for example, because the parties understood that it was important for the people. Also, I think a big difference with America is that we have many more parties, much more than 2 in parliament. Actually, 12 or 13.
As many as that?
Absolutely, because you have the left and conservative version on both sides of the country, north and south. And there is a strong feeling of consensus, because all parties, or many of them, realize that if they don't agree with each other, there is absolutely no decision taken. And at some point, the population would revolt.
I see. Let me just take you a little bit away from Washington, D.C. And as an ambassador, you must have traveled throughout the U.S., meeting ordinary Americans. What were these experiences like? And which particular visits and places stick in your mind, and why? You must have lots of recollections of the United States.
Well, I would say the most surprising was going to Hawaii.
Hawaii?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, which is far away, even from Washington. Yes. It's the opposite of the Earth if you are in Belgium. Yeah. But would you believe that in front of the state parliament in Honolulu, there is one statute, and it's a statute of a Belgian citizen.
No.
Father Damien.
And who's he?
Absolutely. He's fondly remembered by all locals for his role in helping communities fight against leprosis.
Really?
So he was a priest, and he shared a lot of people with leprosis.
Leprosy.
In the late 19th century, and actually died of that illness, and is considered as a semi-god over there.
And they erected a statue to him.
Yeah, absolutely. And he also has his statue in Congress in Washington, D.C. for the same reason, proposed by the state of Hawaii.
My God, that's an amazing story. Now look, there's much talk, and you must be aware of this, and writing about woke culture, although that word has changed its definition from the 60s and 70s, and identity politics, which is you're familiar with, in America, not only in America today. But what was your experience? What did you observe of the so-called culture wars when you lived there?
Well, there are many talks about LGBT rights, but sometimes it's just a bit too much to my liking as a political analyst or even as an ambassador, because there are also other issues in society or in international relations. And I was really puzzled when I met with an advocate of LGBT rights, and in that particular instance about use of toilets by transgender people. Because he told me, well, of course, transgender people should be able to visit the woman's toilet. Yeah. Mm. And I told him, well, maybe we should first ask what women think about it. And his answer was, well, there is no need to, because anyway, when you go to the restrooms, you have to behave properly.
Yeah.
And that was typical of what I said before, is that too many of these people believe that they do not need to convince anymore, because to them it appears obvious, and so they conclude it should be obvious to everyone.
I see.
But in my view, it's a bit forcing your point of view on other people, even without asking what they think about it.
I see that. And in a way that goes counter to good communication, because there's no feedback.
Yes, and also a healthy democratic debate.
Yeah, exactly. My guest today is Ambassador Jean-Arthur Regibeau of Belgium, who has very recently retired from the Foreign Service of his country after a long career, which included postings in Washington, D.C. and Moscow. And we're talking about the USA, Russia and Europe with the hope of a better understanding of all three. Ambassador, what words would you use to describe the Russian state and the Russian Federation today? How would you describe it?
Well, the government nowadays is clearly a dictatorship. So when I was there from 2016, 2020, there was still some space for freedom. Freedom of expression, even to a limited extent. But you had, for example, organization emanating from Russian civil society, because it does exist. And you have some fantastic, courageous people among Russians, including in promoting and defending human rights. But the last nail in the coffin of freedom was when the regime and Vladimir Putin forbid the association memorial. That was in December 21. And this association we found fantastic because they tried to maintain the memory of Stalinist crime, for example. So their own history, because they don't want to conceal the past. They think it should be part of a debate among Russians. And when you realize that these people are even forbidden to exist, then it is the end of any type of freedom.
When you say, just to enlarge on that, when they're forbidden to exist, tell me a little bit more about
so
that
actually,
from a practical point of view. How does that work?
So the regime designated the association as a foreign agent.
Yes.
Of course, the very name is meant to mean they're traitor to the nation. They're a bit like spies. Yeah. And it is in full accordance with the regime's policy, saying that Russia is under attack by the West, that the West wants to impose its own values on Russian society, and saying that in a way, Memorial was part of this attack on the motherland.
I see. This might seem to be a bit of a sensitive question, but I think you'll understand why I'm asking it, particularly in the light of what you've just said to me. How safe is Vladimir Putin in his position? Is he really the power, or merely being manipulated from behind the scenes by more powerful sources? You could explain that to me, but perhaps in the interest of balance, I should ask the same question about Joe Biden or President-elect Donald Trump. Are they being manipulated too? But how do you see that?
So, of course, what I can give is only an opinion. That's my own perception.
Yes.
No, he's not manipulated, and he's a true leader of the system. But the system is not made of just one person, the president. No, it's much broader than that, but it's a very opaque system in Russia.
We don't know these faces.
No. They are deep inside the Kremlin, but Putin has many advisors, so he's certainly not alone. My own feeling also is that is a bit in the center of that system, i.e. is the ultimate referee. But he's the guy taking responsibility and taking the big question. So I don't see him as manipulated, and I don't think is currently weak. Also, it's very important in the Russian political culture. A leader has to appear strong. Because if he appears weak, he might disappear from power in a matter of weeks, because that's the social contract in Russia. Maybe election is not so important as in our countries in the West, but what is very important in the Russian political culture is to have a strong leader, because his first mission is to guarantee the security of the community and the motherland.
And you, obviously, as ambassador, must have met him, presented your credentials.
Yes, I did.
Yes,
yeah.
Okay. And I'm just very curious, because what one sees on television is very limited and very two-dimensional of these leaders, and one doesn't know. Did Russians speak their mind to you about their own country? I mean, their own government and neighbouring Europe? And what did they say to you? And did you believe them? I mean, how free are they to speak? What was your experience?
So remember, this was before the invasion of Ukraine, up to 2020. And to, I would say, my pleasant surprise, yes, Russians were very open. And my experience with the Russian citizens are quite positive. Whether we were in agreement or not, but they were ready to engage. Very proud of their own country, and this I can understand, but also ready to listen. And my point was, well, I will speak about my own country, Belgium, and what I want to do is also you to speak about your own country, so that we understand each other much better. And indeed, they were expressing their views, sometimes a bit critical about their own political system, sometimes supporting it, but it was a real dialogue.
We won't go into the details of the conflict. We just don't have time for that with Ukraine. But do you think the war with Ukraine will end in armistice or victory? I mean, how do you see things? I know you're not a military man, but eventually we have to talk about these things.
Well, definitely, especially that now the Ukrainian president himself says that the war should end by 2025, so next year. So the question is how. It might be through an armistice, but that's not the main thing. Armistice means that weapons do not speak anymore, which would be a good thing in itself. But what type of peace would follow? I think that's even more important. Would that mean that the might of the aggressor would appear to win? That would not be good for the rest of us in Europe.
Well, the Baltic states, Moldova, those sorts of countries, Georgia, Armenia.
Absolutely, and so that would threaten the security of us all, not just the security of Ukrainians. So the very tricky issue is how to find the right balance. We can only take note of the Russian occupation of 20% of Ukraine territory, but how the peace will be concluded will be definitive for the future of Europe and our own security, not just Ukraine.
Just to go back to America, and then we're going to finish off with a few discussion points about Europe. Europeans probably think they know Americans well because it's an open society and movies and television bring it into our own homes. But based on your experience, what are the most frequent misunderstandings between Europeans, and I include the British Isles in that, and Americans?
Well, I think first the importance of religious freedom in the U.S., because that was the basic reason why the first migrants came from Europe to the U.S., is to be free to exercise their own religion, the ones they had decided. It implies also a very different conception for the state, for government. In Europe, we find it normal that the role has a protective role, be it about security or about social security. Not so much in the US. Most of Americans say that the government should just get out of the way. It translates, for example, in Europe, regulating heavily and taking regulation as a precaution, whereas in the US you have much less regulation, and the idea is, well, if there is a problem, we will go to court and we'll see what will happen. So these are, for example, two main differences. Of course, there are differences in the healthcare system, in the education system. What is very puzzling for us European, all of us, is the absence of gun control in the country. But it seems to be very ingrained in American culture to the point that it's impossible to come to any decision in Congress.
That is a very difficult one. I mean, you mentioned in your speech, and I've mentioned it before in my interviews with Americans, that there are more guns than people in a democracy. Are you worried about the future of Europe? I mean, the continent and the European Union? I mean, when you cogitate about your own continent, how do you see it, the future?
Yes, and here I speak, of course, in a personal capacity. I'm a bit worried because it seems to me that, yes, Europe reacted in many ways in the right way to the invasion of Ukraine. We supported Ukraine financially. We even sent some weapons. We took, that's too often forgotten, about 9 million refugees, which is quite an achievement, Switzerland included. But I'm a bit worried because right now I don't see enough unity among the 27 members of the EU to take more responsibility, especially when it comes to security issues, because that's the main issue exposed by the war in Ukraine. So are we in a position to resist a Russian aggression if any more comes? Not just militarily, because it can be hybrid. Just today I read in the news that a cable between Finland and Germany has been broken, and it might be the Russians. So how far are we ready to cooperate among Europeans to defend against such an aggression in a new situation where Donald Trump has clearly said, and many American experts with him, well, Europe should take care of its own security because we need to concentrate on the Pacific.
Before we close, we really can't have a discussion about Europe and America and security without discussing NATO. NATO's headquarters is in your country. I've been there, SHAPE headquarters. The European Parliament is there. It's an important country. How do you see the developing role of NATO, now that it's much bigger, which was not Putin's intent, but the sands have shifted quite dramatically? How do you see NATO, Europe, America?
Well, you know, from a Belgian point of view, it has always been very easy since almost 1945. We always wanted a strong European pillar within NATO. And since then, we have already always believed that strengthening the European pillar in terms of security, in terms of defense instrument, it also strengthens NATO, because for us, one is equal to the other. When we strengthen the European Union, we also strengthen NATO. We have only one set of armored force, no two.
I see. Okay. Now, I was just puzzled. Just seeing, this is just my personal view, that Europe has to some extent had a free ride for a long time, and its very attractive social democracy and social welfare system meant that governments didn't have to spend money on defense. They could spend it on other things, which the Americans didn't. And often forget that when they start discussing defense expenditure, the 20, 30, 40 years that have gone on in the past, when that money was used on other things which could have been used on buying guns and munitions.
Yeah, but I would not fully subscribe to that argument, because actually Europeans were spending a lot more than today on defense during the Cold War. And even at that time, we had developed social security system and Americans did not. But it is true that Europeans took benefit of the peace dividend, we might say, after the Cold War. And now we have woken up. Since 2018, more or less, we are increasing the defense budget again. But first, not enough. And second, and most surprisingly, what is the state of the defense industry in Europe? Well, are we in a position to develop what we need to guarantee our own security?
Last question, Jean-Arthur. You told me before, when we were talking, that you spend some time now talking to younger people. What is, in your opinion, the biggest contributor to better mutual understanding among peoples? How should we go about achieving that? And maybe it may be too late for old people like you and me. We've been around a long time, but we've got children and grandchildren. How do you see the future for them achieving what the point of this radio discussion is, better understanding between all of us?
I think a word that's probably not used enough in a positive sense, that's curiosity.
Curiosity, yeah.
And that's, for example, a lesson I remember from my own father. He used to tell me, I will learn until the day of my death.
Yeah.
And it's about learning, it's about trying to understand. And it does not mean that you always need to agree with the people you're talking to or the people you're listening to, but the very fact that you are learning, that you're curious to learn about the opinion of other people, I think that's crucial.
Well, thank you. It's been fascinating listening to you. The problem with these sorts of conversations, they could go on because there's so much. It's a bit like peeling an onion. But I thank you for all the careful explanations of these complex issues. My guest today has been Honorary Ambassador Jean-Arthur Regibeau of Belgium, who's recently retired after a long career, which included, among other places, the United States and Russia. Thank you, Jean-Arthur.
It was a pleasure, Michael.
Thanks for listening to the Mackay Interview podcast, brought to you by Kyoto Japan Automotive Group, a company which I've known personally for over 20 years, and your one-stop shop for tyres, batteries and auto parts. Visit their website at www.kyotojap.com for more details. And you can find more podcasts on Anchor FM. Just Google Mackay Interview Anchor FM. Thanks again for listening.